Hi, everybody. We are just going to give folks a minute or two to log on, and then we're going to get started. We have a great webinar for you today, but we want to make sure that as many folks as possible can get logged on before we actually get started. So give us just another minute or so. For folks who are just logging on, we're just going to provide another minute or so to get everybody on the platform that is registered. The number of participants keeps growing pretty quickly, so we'll give everybody another minute or so before we get started. Okay, great. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 2:32. We have a packed agenda for you all today. I know that a few of you are still logging on, but I'm going to do some opening remarks. So hopefully everybody is successful in getting on the platform for us. Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to have you with us today. I want to welcome you all to the second webinar in our current series of webinars that are jointly produced by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Just want to make sure that we're still good. Folks definitely can introduce themselves in the chat. We'd love to see where you're coming from while we make sure that everybody is online. Great. So these webinars are designed to do two main things. The first is to inform our community of homelessness and housing providers and advocates, including people with lived experience of homelessness, about the very serious threats that are faced by people experiencing homelessness and the programs that serve them at the federal, state, and local levels. And then second is really to discuss and highlight the best evidence-based practices and policies for actually reducing homelessness at the community level, including Housing First. And welcome again, everybody. I'm your moderator for today. My name is Ann Oliva. I am the Chief Executive Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. As many of you watching today's webinar may know, anti-Housing First legislation was introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives during the last Congress. That proposal included provisions requiring HUD to divert about half of its continuum of care homelessness funding to service providers that may be operating high barrier programs that deny housing and services to people who are experiencing homelessness who, among other things, fail to meet strict standards for sobriety and substance use, including programs that either didn't apply for continuum of care funding or did apply but scored too low to be awarded any funding. And that certainly is a big concern for us here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and among our partners. And while that anti-Housing First legislation was not given a hearing when Maxine Waters chaired the House Financial Services Committee, we understand that the committee's new leadership supports that legislation, and we know that its sponsor will look for opportunities to move that legislation forward during the next 2 years. So, of course, this is of great concern to us. So why are we calling this webinar A World Without Housing First? So I think it's important to note that critics of the Housing First approach are really careful not to say what they would put in place of Housing First as an approach, which really is costly and unnecessarily high barrier programs that allow providers to not serve people experiencing homelessness on the basis of things like sobriety, substance use, some mental health conditions, and perhaps for other reasons like sexual orientation, family status, and gender identity. Critics of Housing First also avoid talking about the inherent cruelty of denying housing and services to people in need, many of whom, most of whom, all of whom want the housing and services that should be available to them. So many of you on this webinar know that getting people housed is really life or death, and it makes no sense to deny admission or remove people from housing programs for failure to meet strict one-size-fits-all standards, especially given that those problems become worse because of homelessness, and that many people experiencing homelessness develop substance use and mental health conditions after they become homeless. It's a part of living on the street. And part of this connection really is the flawed assumption that homelessness is the result of personal failures and bad decisions. And if that's your mindset, then it's easy to believe that a person who isn't participating in a drug or alcohol recovery program also doesn't deserve housing, or that this same person is somehow choosing to be homeless if they're camping in public space and therefore should be subject to arrest. So criminalization really is something that's growing across the country that is tied to this anti-housing first approach. We know that the roots of homelessness are systemic and not personal. And the truth is that mandating participation in recovery programs or other types of services doesn't end a person's homelessness. Housing does. Passing a law that forbids someone from being unsheltered and out of doors doesn't solve homelessness. Housing does. So back to why we called this particular webinar today, A World Without Housing First. It's because we think that the best way to show what life would be like, both for people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as for the programs who serve them, is to remind folks what we know from the time before Housing First was widely adopted. And to that end, we're going to hear from some remarkable speakers today. First, we'll hear from Kelly King-Horn, the Executive Director of Homeward in Richmond, Virginia. She runs one of the nation's most successful homeless service programs, and she has served long enough in that role to be able to remind us what homelessness services were like before Housing First, and what would be lost if the legislation that I mentioned earlier became law. Dr. Sam Cimberas, who is currently the founder and CEO of Pathways Housing First Institute in Santa Monica, California, is a legendary figure in our field. Along with people experiencing homelessness and other colleagues, Dr. Cimberas developed the Housing First approach that's so crucial to our work. Chrissy Canganelli is the Executive Director of Shelter House in Iowa City, Iowa. I had the great fortune to meet Chrissy earlier this year during a tour of her state, and we're going to hear from her about her highly successful program and how it adopted Housing First practices. We'll also hear from Donald Whitehead, who is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless and is one of our field's most inspiring and insightful leaders. I'm also really proud to call Donald a friend. Nobody is in a better position to talk about what the attack on Housing First and the efforts to criminalize people experiencing homelessness mean for those who are really impacted. And we'll end with Steve Burke, my own Chief Policy Officer here at the Steve Berg. Did I just say Burke? I meant Berg. Our own Chief Policy Officer for the National Alliance to End Homelessness. He has perhaps the toughest job of all, which is summing up everything that we've learned today from our speakers and giving us some practical advice for educating our lawmakers on how to preserve Housing First and defeat these efforts to criminalize people. After Steve's remarks, I'll tell you a little bit about the next webinar, and then we'll wrap up. So by the end of this webinar today, I think you'll have a better understanding of the important role that Housing First plays in getting people housed and helping communities avoid significant costs associated with homelessness, in reducing suffering and mortality among people experiencing homelessness, and in promoting public health and racial equity. But before we get started with all the speakers I just mentioned, I'm really pleased to introduce two veteran lawmakers who I have had the privilege to work with over many years and who are longtime leaders of congressional efforts to eliminate homelessness. First, we're going to hear from Representative Maxine Waters, who is now the ranking member or lead Democrat on the House Financial Services Committee, which has jurisdiction over federal housing and homelessness programs. She's the author of the landmark Ending Homelessness Act, as well as the Housing as Infrastructure Act. She also wrote the historic investments in vouchers, public housing, and new affordable housing investments that were ultimately included in the Build Back Better Act, which won the support of the president and passed the House. And then we're going to hear from Senator Susan Collins, who has been the ranking member or lead Republican of the Senate Transportation HUD or THUD Appropriations Subcommittee, which is the subcommittee responsible for funding housing and homelessness programs. But now Senator Collins is the ranking member on the full Senate Appropriations Committee, which means that she will ultimately be the lead Republican on all 12 appropriations subcommittees, which are responsible for funding agencies ranging from agriculture to Veterans Affairs. And I'm pleased to say that thanks in part to her leadership, HUD's homeless programs got their biggest increase ever in the FY23 bill. And during my tenure at HUD, I had the privilege to work with Senator Collins on the highly successful Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, or YHDP, which Senator Collins was a major champion of. So with that, let's hear from Ranking Member Waters.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the warm welcome. Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased for the opportunity to join the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the National Alliance to End Homelessness today to participate in such an important and timely event. As the homelessness crisis continues to rise in our nation, it's more important than ever that we use our collective power to fight for affordable housing and promote the importance of housing first policies. The simple truth is that the housing first approach is a proven, bipartisan, and evidence-based solution to addressing homelessness by ensuring households are provided with housing assistance and services without any preconditions. This approach not only provides housing and services, but is shown to significantly reduce the cost of helping the most people possible. Investing in housing first is essential for ensuring that our most underserved communities have a safe place to live. This approach acknowledges that housing serves as a foundation for achieving other successful outcomes, whether it's employment, sobriety, or better health outcomes. Every single day that we fail to act, we're paying the cost of disinvestment. This is unacceptable. That's why I'm here to urge you all to continue to reach out to your members of Congress and explain the importance of the housing first approach. Our nation's homelessness and affordable housing crisis impacts all of us, regardless of party affiliation. And rest assured that I will continue the work in the 118th Congress to push my colleagues too. As many of you know, I've long fought for pieces of legislation to combat homelessness in the United States, including my bill, Ending Homelessness Act of 2021, which would expand the Housing Choice Voucher program and assist families experiencing homelessness. I was proud to have secured 70,000 new housing choice vouchers to help people experiencing homelessness, and I am looking forward to working with the Biden administration to provide more of these kinds of resources for our communities. I am pleased that you'll be right there by my side in this fight. So thank you so very much for inviting me to participate. Let's get on with the fight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Waters. Next up,
Thank you.
Oh,
very much.
Next up, we're going to hear from Senator Collins from Maine.
Thank you for your dedication to addressing the needs of unsheltered individuals and families across our nation. Your focus on Housing First is helping to reduce the number of people who are homeless. When combined with supportive services, this key first step of providing housing stability significantly improves outcomes for many people who are struggling and for the communities in which they live. The shortage of affordable housing is a growing crisis nationwide. No single entity can successfully resolve this challenge. It requires both commitment and collaboration at the federal, state, and local levels. It also requires strong partnerships between housing and service providers. Your engagement with your elected officials is critical to promoting better understanding of effective approaches like Housing First. As the leader of the Housing Appropriations Subcommittee, I know what a difference advocacy efforts can make. Working together, we have improved the federal response to homelessness among our veterans, our youth, and the unsheltered. We have also enhanced emergency assistance for victims of domestic violence. These successes are possible because of involved individuals just like you, but we still have a long path to travel. Thank you for your commitment and keep up the great work.
Thank you so much to Senator Collins for taking the time out to talk to us about her commitment to
Thank you.
and to Housing First. Next up, I'd like to introduce Kelly King Horn, again, the Executive Director of Homeward, and someone that I know I have been working with for many, many years. Kelly?
Anne, thank you, and thanks to all the partners on this call and everyone joining us today. Can go to the next slide. This year does start my 20th year at Homeward and working in my community to help reduce homelessness for the people in our community who are our neighbors. So next slide, please. I'll just give you a little bit of information about our community, and I know we have some of our awesome Richmond partners on this call, but we are a regional continuum of care, so we work with the capital of Virginia, Richmond, and the 7 surrounding counties. We started working together in the late 90s, and my agency, Homeward, was created 25 years ago in order to support this collaborative effort. And for those of you working in this space, just wanted to give a little bit of information, sort of insider baseball about, our role at Homeward as the collaborative applicant, HMIS, all of that. But next slide. I wanted to just share, based on the history that I have working and that Homeward has working in this space in our community, of what our community was like before we adopted Housing First. And just for context, we adopted Housing First in the time frame of 2007 to 2009. And so really, this is sort of a graphic of what our community looked like then. I mean, we had people, our neighbors, in a housing crisis, and they would have to call or go around to each shelter to try to find a way to get help, to see if they were eligible for help, to see if they were a match for the programs that were being offered. So next slide. And so this, I know there's a lot of text here, but I just want to highlight a few things. In Richmond, we often think about what is it that we're trying to do together? What are the problems that we're trying to solve? And, I tried to think about this, what is it like before we had Housing First, for, our neighbors without a safe place to go or other needs. And really what we saw is that, people were, again, searching for a match, like what programs were being offered, could they meet those programs, what did they have to do in order to get assistance? And really the key question was, how long did they need to wait? Because we were offering, very different kinds of programs, we couldn't meet the immediate crisis of people sleeping in cars or outside who really had no safe place to be. For our homeless service providers, again, we were all thinking about a number of questions. How do we say no to people who are in front of us? How do we fund these services? What are the program offerings we should have? And I've bolded the questions that were really like the questions that moved us forward as a community. And so before we adopted Housing First as a shared approach, we had questions like, we just assumed people outside wanted to be outside and they would come in to get our help when they needed it. We had started to think about what we needed to serve the people most in need in our community. And I think just remember, this happened during the 2008 housing crisis when the numbers started to go up and we were clearly not equipped to respond to the need at the level that we were seeing in our community. And then from the community of providers as a whole, right? We were a very collaborative group in Richmond, as hopefully some of my colleagues on this call will attest. But we weren't seeing that we were really targeting our limited resources to the people who needed it most. And we were really trying to think, how do we take things to scale? And how do we get the other resources in our community to the table to help address this crisis? Next slide, please. So this was our community of providers before we adopted Housing First. I mean, we have awesome providers in Richmond. They were incredibly collegial, especially, in those early years. But we didn't have a clear and unifying goal, right? People would say, well, we're concerned with quality of life. We're concerned with mental health. We're concerned with, just any number of different things, right? Everyone had their own spin on addressing the issues. And, one example that really stuck with me, right? I had young children at this time who are now teenagers, right? And, we had providers say, well, people need parenting classes. And I was like, yeah, everybody needs parenting classes. And the housing status isn't what makes a difference. Parenting is hard, right? And so we're thinking, what is it that we're actually trying to do together? Because we were focusing on the services and program offerings, people stayed in programs longer, sometimes just waiting in a shelter in order to save enough money each week from employment in order to secure housing. While we know that people waited outside or in dangerous situations while they were waiting for this space to open up. We did not actively work to engage people sleeping outside in our community. We just assumed, or they're just waiting for shelter, or they'll come in when they're ready. And most importantly, I think thinking about, from Homeward's role, is that we really hesitated to make policy decisions or funding decisions that rock the boat in any way, because it would seem subjective. We didn't have a shared goal or a shared understanding of what we were trying to do. We didn't have really strong accountability measures. And so we didn't want to jeopardize any of that. But at this time, probably in many of your communities, we had funders starting to ask about outcomes and why there's so many nonprofits and what are we doing, right? And this is all in the context of the subprime lending crisis and that impact that we had, that we were seeing in our community. Next slide, please. And so we also, we really in 2007 in particular started to really say, talk with people experiencing this crisis in our community and to hear what they had to say. And we knew, when we really started to engage in conversation in encampments, outdoors, where people were, we learned that they weren't necessarily just waiting for shelter, but they might be interested in talking about housing, and that really just, our assumption about what was going on with them was incorrect. And then we, learned from talking to them. We were seeing people leaving programs at a certain period, like they had gotten enough from our system and were ready to get on with their lives and what they were trying to do. And I think most, candidly, we realized, and this, I put an exclamation point because this should have happened sooner, that people experiencing homelessness were people, right? And that the difference was housing, right? And again, I go back to my parenting example. Parenting's hard for everyone. You don't need parenting classes specifically in a shelter. It's stable housing would make the biggest difference there. Next slide, please. And so when we adopted Housing First, the biggest impact that we saw was the community clarity and accountability, right? So we really began to understand that we could end homelessness. It didn't mean we had solved all of the world's problems, but that more limited, more targeted goal had a huge impact on our community, on all of us and the neighbors that we were working with to get into housing. And it allowed us to identify what partnerships we needed in the community. Were there other services in place? Like, who offered parenting classes, and how could we connect people who were interested in them, to those classes, once they were in housing and had space to think about what people wanted from their lives, then, making those connections. By really focusing on serving the most vulnerable, we were able to really see and feel the impact of our work. We weren't just doing helpful things, we were doing impactful things together. That led to increased investments that allowed us to do more of what we were trying to do together. And so even though some programs were cut, overall, we were able to do more and make a bigger difference, sort of increase the scale of our response. So having that shared vision really helped us make difficult decisions. We now had an objective measure of what it was we were trying to do together, right? And that allowed us to do policy decisions, to move money, to recommend that programs lose a long-standing HUD grant. Really hard work. But we were able to come together and make those changes. And so we also then were able to push other systems in our community to make, to step up and do what they needed to do to provide the services that people wanted. And we stopped trying to be all things to all people. And we really worked to develop compassionate ways to say yes, to those most in need, so that, we were able to have that big impact. And that's really, Housing First allowed us to become a system. And so that's my last slide. I know these will be made available, but the next slide just has some contact information for us, and I'm always happy to take questions.
Great. Kelly, we have a few questions for you in the Q&A box, but I'm going to start with my own question since I have the microphone here. Can you talk a little bit about how you've thought about equity, specifically racial equity in your work, and what Housing First means for that?
Yeah, I think, so thank you, Anne. I mean, for me personally, and I think for our, system of providers and funders and all of our community partners, when we began to really focus on listening to what people experiencing homelessness told us that they needed and what they wanted for their lives, I think that's when we really said, this is about dignity, right? That, at the root of equity, I think, is a belief in the dignity and worth of all people, and that their experiences are valid and worth support. And so for us, Housing First really allowed us to sort of question our assumptions about what people needed, what they were trying to do. When we focused on helping people become stable in housing, then that freed them up to then, take it from there. Like, did they want parenting classes? Did they want budgeting classes? Did they want a different kind of job? Did they want to join a community of faith? And they weren't subject to what we thought they needed, right? Because so often, before Housing First, we made assumptions about what people needed to fix themselves. And we're like, none of us are fixed, right? And that was, again, it shouldn't have been a big breakthrough, but it was, right? Really listening to the people who are most impacted. And in our community, it's absolutely, people of color, African Americans in Richmond, Virginia. And so Housing First really allowed us to lean into that.
Yeah, I recently was in your community and heard very much that from people who were or had recently experienced homelessness. So I appreciate that answer. I have a couple more for you. From one of our attendees whose name I don't know. How did you get providers and your internal team on board with the culture change to Housing First? Sort of like what did that look like?
So there are a couple different components of that. So we are a pretty data heavy organization, right? And all of our data comes from talking with people experiencing homelessness, either, through services that are recorded in our database or, we do point in time counts twice a year. So that really allows us to have a lot of conversations. And so part of it was reflecting on what we were really hearing, right? Like, what did people really want for their lives? And then then we did training, right? We did a lot of trainings. Like we invited folks to come to our community once a year. We have a best practices conference where we could learn together. And so I think that learning together is a key part. Like we would all hear the same information and then we could talk about it. And then candidly, moving money, right? Like some people never got on board and we said, okay, cool. You can do that if you want, but you can't use this money to do that. We need to go for impact, right? And so it was all of those different pieces together, but I gotta give a lot of credit, like our providers were amazing. And we, as a community, have a lot of people with lived experience of homelessness, like as part of our network, right? I mean, it's a pretty significant factor. And so just listening to each other helped us to do more. And then we realized that we could serve more people at less cost, right? And that sort of, as Representative Waters said, like that just reinforced it.
Yeah. So I have one question, one last question for you before we take questions at the end. One, this is kind of a dual question. A couple of folks wanted to know what you mean by we, and I think it's that your organization leads the continuum of care, but you should specify that.
Right.
And where does emergency shelter fit into your work?
Yeah, so thank you. So when I say we, I'm not sure which context, I'm often talking about, I have the privilege of working in a continuum of care that's incredibly collaborative, that for a small community, we have more than 34 partner agencies. So sometimes that we really means our community of providers, and sometimes it means Homeward. So I'm sorry for that confusion. And then the second part of it, Anne, was
shelter. Where does shelter fit?
So, I think early on, a lot of us, when we heard about rapid rehousing, there was some initial conversation that like rapid rehousing was a replacement for shelter. And we're like, no, shelter is a life-saving resource, right? We need good shelter. We need shelter that's going to help people sort of rebound to what they're trying to do in their life. And, it's in one of my slides. So when y'all get this, you can go through it. Shelter can be an important part of the response to homelessness, but what we learned is it can't be a necessary step, right? That people can get connected to housing at almost any point in their journey, and that it's, that's what allows us to customize our response. But it doesn't mean that you don't need shelter. We do. People need a safe place to go in a crisis. But the shelter isn't housing, right? It's a different kind of intervention in the community.
Kelly, thank you so much for your presentation today. There's a ton of stuff in the chat that you probably haven't even looked at yet.
Yeah. So I'll take a look at that. So thank you.
And as always, thank you so much for your work, both nationally and within your own community. We really appreciate it. Next, I want to ask Dr. Semberis to turn on his camera, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, Dr. Semberis.
Thank you, Anne. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Could we go to the first slide, please? So that was a great presentation, and my presentation is not going to be program specific. I sort of took the title literally, and I'm going to describe as best I can how the implementation of Housing First has changed the overall system of homeless services, kind of a broad principles and practices approach. Okay, next slide. So I just wanted to start with a definition. There's a lot of people on the call, and many people use the term Housing First widely. It's become quite disseminated. And many programs that call themselves Housing First have some of the components of Housing First, but not really a Housing First approach overall. So I just want to put down this definition so that when I'm talking about Housing First, we're kind of all on the same page about what this definition is. And I'm talking about the program that has been tested and evaluated across different study trials, and the evidence for its effectiveness is based on this model. the Housing First program has three key components. One is the rent subsidies that people mentioned. Typically a housing choice voucher, could be a project-based voucher, but some means of being able to pay a rent subsidy for clients. It has a supported service team that's not optional. That's actually the entry point of the team is typically the entry point of the program is typically the team. And it could be an ACT team or a case management team, but it's a community-based team that is wrapped around the person with the rent subsidy. And the third component is a philosophical piece about recovery-oriented service and consumer voice and harm reduction and all of the clinical philosophy practices. So it's those three components. And traveling around the country, I can tell you most people get the first two really well and clearly understood. And the third one we sort of struggle with. And fundamentally, Housing First is an approach to housing that separates it from treatment. So housing is offered to people as a basic human right, based on their income needs. Okay, that's the definition that I'm referring to when I say Housing First. Let's go to the second slide. This, okay. So here I'm using a bit of a metaphor here for the purposes of my brief presentation, and to think about all of the people in the United States who are homeless as one city. All right, this is a city, Homelessness USA, and it's a city of 582,462 people, which is the number on the HUD website PIT count from 2022. Now, what I have heard from many people that exit homelessness and come into the Housing First programs is they say this is the first time that someone offered me an exit out of homelessness. And so I would describe the world before Housing First as a world of homeless services that did not really have a direct exit out. You had to go through shelter, transitional, you had to go through treatment, sobriety. There was many steps involved in getting out of homelessness, and many people could not or would not make that trip. I would invite you all to think about something else though, because I don't want to go back to the world where we had homeless services that needed a lot of improvement. But because homelessness in this era started in 1980 something, there are many people on the call that were born, 1985 or later. And so we have here like a two-generational population of providers, advocates, researchers that do not know the world before there was homelessness. Like homelessness was part of the landscape. And so when I ask you to imagine a world without homelessness, the United States without homelessness, it has to be sort of imagined for many of you, whereas for some of us who are older and remember that world, it's like we know it's possible, we know it's achievable, we know it's there, and that's actually, I think, a more powerful and inviting goal to reach. I don't really want to improve the homeless service system. I want to end homelessness, and that's where where we should be living, and I think we can get to it. The thing about this city was that it's an industry. First of all, it's millions and millions of dollars, billions invested in the homeless service industry. And Housing First is one component of it. But before the Housing First entered into the industry included all the things that the outreach programs, the emergency shelters, and transitional drop-in, safe havens, emergency, and also eventually some permanent housing and more permanent housing. And all of this system was organized loosely in a philosophy that, as Anne mentioned in the beginning, some people are advocating that we go back to a treatment first and sobriety system, and then housing, and which is quite disturbing given the evidence of the last 20, 30 years of what is effective and what isn't. But here we are. And that was the system that existed before Housing First. And just to make that absolutely clear, it meant that many programs funded to serve individuals experiencing homelessness and suffering with mental illness or addiction first required people to meet conditions, clinical conditions, not just, you know, the way Section 8 works. You have an income determination for who's eligible for Section 8. This is not only income plus treatment, which is discriminatory because none of us who aren't identified as homeless have to meet clinical criteria when we're leasing an apartment. But because it's a provider system, people did and can get away with that. And this is the system that's being proposed now, as if addiction and mental illness causes homelessness. It co-occurs with homelessness, but what causes homelessness is actually, what causes homelessness is actually the unaffordability of rent. So, sorry, I got distracted by the chat, which I shouldn't be looking at. So we have, you know, this issue of this industry requiring people to get treatment and sobriety before they're homeless. In a recent report by Dennis Culhane, kind of an evaluation of the existing shelter system, he talks about the fact that the shelter industry in this country is funded at the rate of about $10.7 billion a year. And most nights, about 50% of the shelter beds across the country, remain empty. So before Housing First, and also, you know, during and after Housing First, we still have not found the cure for addiction or mental illness. But if we continue to insist that people are clean and sober and in treatment before we give them housing, they will never exit homelessness USA. Next slide, please. One of the key features of the Housing First is that you know, about this choice and consumer voice. But before this idea of consumer choice, the homeless service industry for housing and services did not really have space for including input from consumers, and does not in many instances today. Most services in the traditional system operate primarily under an assessment and placement mandate, and the assessment and placement is made by the provider. The consumer has little say-so. Industry is where, you know, because the demand for services always exceeds the supply for services, or the demand for housing always exceeds the supply for housing, staff working in these programs are under tremendous pressure to do something for a great many people, and they don't have the time for individual stories. So in this environment of high demand and limited resources, rationing is essential. And the system uses a quick and dirty assessment and placement methodology. Individual needs are assessed using a checklist, and depending on the score, the case manager determines what kind of need the person has and what kind of services they're eligible to receive, and sends them on their way, usually by way of a referral to the next service, or when they tell them to wait until their name comes up to the top of the list. It's in this system, in the placement and assessment and placement system, it's the client's responsibility to follow up and make it to the next place on their referral. If they don't make it to the next service, no one will miss them, because everyone working in the system is overwhelmed with too high caseloads. Nor is it anyone's responsibility to figure out where they are. So in this service system, people experiencing homelessness are essentially in nowhere land, between the exit of one program that referred them and before the entrance to the next one, where they never arrive. They find themselves among the hundreds or the thousands of other inhabitants of homelessness USA. After Housing First, there was an insistence that the program should offer choice, person-centered care, and listen closely and include the input of people with lived experience, include the program participants in the design, operation, and governance of the program. You know, this is what Housing First is insisting on and is based on. And today, not only do we have the treatment first philosophy reemerging but we have both in California and New York lot of publicity for involuntary treatment of addiction in California and for mental illness in New York. So there is definitely a hardening of attitudes of frustration about this idea of choice or compassionate work and an urgency to do something about the problem that we continue not to have solved effectively. And basically the mandate to do something about the problem and political messages really aimed at sort of addressing the frustration of the public rather than helping people who are experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. Another dimension of change before and after Housing First is that before, during and after, many programs that provide shelter and housing services do so under the same roof. And as I mentioned, require sobriety and compliance, not only at admission, but as an ongoing condition of tenancy. So in most homeless programs, when people relapse, they face the crisis of the relapse they're going through, but also they face the risk that they will be evicted because of their use. Similarly, people who are needing hospitalization or who are arrested are discharged from programs because the program needs to make the place available for the next client. And then upon release from jail or discharge from the hospital, they have to begin all over again to find a place. So before Housing First began, there was no harm reduction housing and services. There was in the HIV/AIDS community harm reduction housing, but not for people with mental illness or addiction who were homeless. There were no commitments to the position that we will not evict people for treatment noncompliance when they relapse, and that what we will do is operate like what Housing First suggests, essentially a program with a no discharge policy. The next slide, please. Whose responsibility is it? Now, before Housing First, staff or programs really did not take responsibility for client outcomes. The responsibility for outcomes falls on the client. If the clients don't show up for treatment, it's because they're treatment resistant. It's not because the treatment is not useful or meaningful or we have failed to connect with them. If they don't make it to their housing interview, it's because they're not housing ready, not because we didn't offer transportation and they had no money to get there. Before Housing First, we blamed the client for failing to reach their goals. In Housing First, the program takes responsibility for the client's outcomes, both its successes and its failures. It's up to us to engage, it's up to us to follow through, it's up to us to make the appointments happen. And that's where the rubber hits the road. We can't just celebrate successes and blame the client for failures. We got to own both. Final slide is about evaluation. And before we're talking about evidence-based practices, most programs and most contracts are based on the idea that the more people, how many people do you serve? And of course, the numbers are always high because the programs were serving a lot of people, and so contracts were renewed on the basis of units of service. And there is a need to have a performance-based contract. If our goal is to end homelessness, maybe we need to move the funding model. The previous speaker said that it's money that drives practice, and if we had performance-based contracts so that programs were paid to place people in housing, that would result in different outcomes. But I think post-Housing First, there's been a much more, because it was controversial when it started, there was much more attention to evidence and data and being accountable for the results of the program. Okay, I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions. Somewhere in the chat, quite a long time ago at this point, and the chat is pretty active today, folks wanted to get a little bit of a clearer understanding of what's required and not required in the Housing First model that Pathways use, the Pathways Housing First model. What services are required or not required?
What's required on the housing side is that the person has to sign a standard lease and basically comply with the conditions of tenancy, no illegal activities, pay the rent on time. People typically pay 30% of their income and meet all of the same terms and conditions that the rest of us do. It's a standard lease. And for some people, that's a high bar, and that's why they need the support services.
Sure.
On the service side, people have to agree to have a visit by the team, whether it's a case manager, ICM, whatever that service team is.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not negotiable. So, the idea of choice refers to the fact that people can choose what services or what treatments they want. There is no treatment requirement. This case management visit, it's nuanced. It's not a treatment visit. It's a safety check. So we need to go and see how people are doing. And it's up to us to figure out how to make that happen. Okay, so it's it's not coercive. It's done through a kind of a therapeutic alliance, but it's not negotiable. We need to see people. We can't put harm reduction housing in place and not visit people. We need to know that they're safe. So those are the two requirements. The tenancy requirements and the requirement for a visit. And then it's up to the case manager or whoever is visiting to kind of make the relationship in a way that's meaningful and is providing the person the services and the sequence they want, and that's how you build on it.
Yeah, that's a really helpful clarification. Thanks. The last question I'll ask you is really about engaging, and maybe others have thoughts on this as well, but for you, Sam, like specifically, I have a question in the Q&A box about working with a faith-based organization that hasn't really bought into Housing First as a model. Do you have any tips for engaging with either organizations or partners that would bring them sort of into the fold on Housing First?
What I've seen is that the most effective way to change practice is through the funding mechanism. That the contract says you're going to house people without requiring sobriety, you're going to make visits, and so on. I think that the program is, I hope I've conveyed this idea that it's values-based. You have to be comfortable with consumer-driven, with harm reduction. So organizations that are already like that will be very good as early adapters. Now, it's difficult to persuade people to change their values. You can incentivize people to change their practice. But, some people, for example, did not believe in the program, but the agency brought in a Housing First program, and that was their job description. Suddenly they had to operate in this way. And then by actually doing the practice, they saw the results and liked them and sort of converted. There was a conversion experience through the doing, So I think, visiting other programs where you see how it works is also helpful. So you can sort of imagine it in practice. So it's not abstract is a useful thing. But in most of the implementations we've seen across the country, and like the HUD-VASH program, was basically a mandate, top down. We're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and then training to teach people how to do it. And there's still, considerable resistance within that, but it's like, well, suddenly it became the job, and the practice moved hugely in that direction.
Yeah, that's really helpful insights for our folks out there who are working with partners that maybe haven't quite bought into the concept yet, and for funders, including philanthropy, who might be listening in today, who have some leverage here. Dr. Tsimberis, thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to say one. I guess I don't think we want to change the whole world into a Housing First world. I think there's room for recovery-oriented programs and abstinence-based. What we want to do is have a wide variety of options so that client chooses where they want to be. We know from all of these years of practice that most people want a Housing First thing, but not necessarily everyone. And so we don't have to bring everybody along. I think, 70% or 80% would be great.
Yeah, that's great. And I know I'll put it in the chat on that point of having abstinence-based programs or recovery housing in particular. I know when I was still at HUD, I authored a policy brief on how to do, I worked with the folks at Central City Concern in Portland, Oregon, on how to do really solid recovery housing within a housing first overall approach in your system. So I'd be happy to put that in the chat for folks as well. But right now, thank you so much, Dr. Semberis. Right now,
My pleasure, thank you.
we're going to turn over to Chrissy Canganelli, who is the Executive Director, as I mentioned earlier, of Shelter House in Iowa City. Chrissy, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I did prepare comments so that I can make best use of the time that I have. So I do apologize, but I will be reading my comments. To make clear what we stand to lose should HUD divert funding away from Housing First, I must first share what we have gained, the changes and journey made, and the impacts achieved as we've committed to Housing First. Shelter House is a homeless service provider located in Iowa City, Iowa. We offer everything from emergency shelter for single adults and families to street outreach, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. Our emergency shelter is low barrier, and through our rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, we are fully aligned with the Housing First approach. Everything we do is intended to help people move into and retain housing. Iowa City sits astride two major interstates. We are home to the University of Iowa. We have the highest housing costs in the state and some of the lowest vacancy rates in rental housing. We have two psychiatric inpatient units, one at the VA and a second at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. These factors combined yield a higher per capita incidence of homelessness in our community than most other areas of the state and a higher rate of chronic homelessness. When I joined Shelter House in 1998, we were steadfastly aligned with the housing ready or stair-step approach. We didn't know or use the terminology or frame our work in that way. We simply understood that requiring sobriety, medication compliance, employment, and program compliance of the people we served was expected of us, mandated even by our funders, both public and private. It was how we demonstrated responsibility and accountability to our funders. It was how we demonstrated good stewardship to our community. It was all we knew, and at the time it was unchallenged in our community, in our state, and across much of the nation. And it was wrong. We were late to align with Housing First, early by Iowa standards, but late in comparison to much of the nation. We didn't open our first low barrier shelter until 2015, and even then it was only open during the winter. Our HUD programming didn't begin to shift until 2016. This work has never been easy, but 10 years ago it was easier. It was easier because everything we did was structured in a way so as to vet the sickest and most vulnerable out. Because that's what happens when you require sobriety, treatment, and program compliance as preconditions to housing assistance. Over the years, we added shelter capacity, initially through a winter overflow program with our local faith communities, and initially by building a later by building a larger shelter. But if you weren't sober, you weren't getting a bed. It didn't matter how cold it was. And if you had a bed but didn't follow through with your program, you risked losing it. And if shelter was the only access point to housing services, you weren't getting past go. Everything was about normalizing the experience of homelessness. The work was hard enough. Our existence was considered necessary, but barely tolerated, even with all the rules in place. Under-resourced and underfunded, we operated in a state of crisis, much as the people we served. Years of community and legal opposition to our campaign to build a larger shelter taught me there was no other way. I became a skeptic of new ideas and of change, and I was wrong. But during the winter of 2013 to 2014, something happened. A polar vortex hit Iowa. And night after night, while our shelter was full, people who'd been vetted out of our shelter and some who no longer even tried coming in, came into City Hall to sleep on the floor, encouraged by local law enforcement to seek shelter and safety to come in from the cold. No questions asked, and one by one they did. The following spring, Iowa City Police approached our local homeless coordinating board in the hope that a new approach could be considered in preparation for the next winter. The consensus was that Shelter House should take the lead in developing a low barrier shelter to be made available during the winter months. Beyond the first responders and emergency room staff who saw a low barrier shelter as a much needed resource and relief to their burden of care, consideration of opening the low barrier shelter was not a popular proposition. There was not a groundswell of support. At the time, it was considered high risk, if not radical. A decision that required consideration and discernment even within my own organization. But we leaned in, and we've never looked back. We built off of the experience of that Band-Aid of a service, demonstrating significant decreases in incarceration rates and ambulance and emergency room utilization that winter, to make the case for a more permanent solution, permanent supportive housing. This was the beginning of what would prove over time to be a paradigm shift in our approach to homeless services in our community, a shift and change to housing first. It was the beginning of the hard and necessary work to realign our resources, our culture, to shift from managing homelessness to ending it, building new partnerships, finding new champions. In 2016, we retooled our existing Continuum of Care project to rapid rehousing. In 2018, we shifted all shelter services to low barrier. In January of 2019, with additional Continuum of Care funds, we opened our first single-site permanent supportive housing property with 24 units. During the course of the pandemic, we grew our capacity threefold through a scattered site approach, leveraging mainstream vouchers and our partnerships with local landlords. And in 2022, with the third Continuum of Care grant, added another 36 units of permanent supportive housing in a single site development. All permanent supportive housing is dedicated for chronically homeless. And while not yet right-sized, it is the right response, and it is working. The work is complicated, and yes, much more difficult. There are days when it's punishing, moments of anguish, moments of joy. People who had been homeless for years, many for decades, living in the most exposed situations, on the streets and in encampments, in and out of our hospitals, jails, shelter, treatment facilities, residential care facilities, and other social services, always returning time and time again to the streets, are today housed, and they are staying housed. They have a lease and the support of a housing voucher. They have a door, they have a home, a permanent one if they so choose. They have care and support at the ready. Decades of homelessness ended. And over time, life changes and transformations, and slowly, ever so slowly, regained health. I must add, the work that we have done to build capacity and align with Housing First has not come at the cost of serving folks for whom homelessness is a singular event. It has been in addition to it. And so what would happen if HUD backed away and diverted funding from Housing First, specifically Continuum of Care funds? For us, it would be a zero-sum game. Continuum of Care funding is our lifeline, because Housing First isn't just about giving people keys to an apartment and walking away. It's walking with them side by side and providing the necessary life and health supports when they are ready. With respect to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, Continuum of Care funds are the primary, if not singular, funding source for that work, with the exception being a modest amount of ESG funding available for rapid rehousing. There are no other state funds in Iowa or private payer sources, and no, Medicaid in Iowa is not a viable option. If HUD backs away from Housing First now, our choices are limited. We could return to predicating services on sobriety, employment, and program compliance, or stay the course and risk having funds cut or entirely lost. If we change course and subordinate housing to compliance and rapid rehousing, we will not only return to vetting people out, but shelter stays will be longer, shelter beds will not turn over as quickly, and unsheltered homelessness will increase. If we impose the same requirements in our permanent supportive housing, the majority of our current tenants will not prevail. No affordable housing provider, no residential care facility, no HAB home, no other entity will step in. They didn't before and they won't now. So eventually these men and women and families will return to homelessness and back to the streets because we were their last door. And that door only so recently opened to them, and unsheltered homelessness will increase. If we stay the course, we risk losing it all, and that includes our infrastructure. In both scenarios, our funding is likely cut and our capacity severely compromised. And here's the reality. At no time have continuum of care funds met the current demand. And that is certainly the case following the pandemic, when pay for direct service providers increased significantly, and necessarily so, just to stay competitive, but not competitive with their peers and mental health providers and other public services, simply with service sector jobs. We're not making hamburgers here. There is no fat or give in our funding. We are not now, nor have we ever been right-sized and sufficiently funded, not in any aspect of our work. And while we've been extraordinarily nimble and creative in the past, this time, I fear we're at a breaking point. And what happens to our community? As we shifted to housing first and developed capacity, we gradually became an intrinsic part of our community's crisis response system. Not just our shelter, but our housing. Our first responders and crisis health services depend on us. What happens when we change course or reduce or eliminate already strained capacity and people return to the street? They will re-enter already stressed and overextended systems that have not begun to recover from the pandemic. The men and women we are housing are no longer living out their lives in public spaces. Law enforcement, fire, and ambulance services are not called to engage with them to the same degree as before. They are not in the emergency rooms and inpatient units as they were before, because we exist, because they are housed, because they are supported. This proposition to back away from housing first comes at the same time that COVID response funding for shelter operations is depleted. We're already feeling the strain. Our shelters and housing services remained open throughout the course of the pandemic. We didn't shut down. There was no virtual scenario. We leaned in and carried on. Our shelters are a backup. And shelters are not in a position to heave and respond. Something needs to be done, and we have practical suggestions based on evidence and experience. Backing away from housing first is not one of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. I saw, I tried to monitor the chat a little bit while you were speaking, and I think that the word I saw show up a number of times is compelling. The compelling argument that you make around that shift from managing homelessness to ending it is something that so many people need to hear, and we are so pleased to have you with us today. I'm going to ask you a quick question about buy-in. It's similar to the question that I've asked others on this panel, and that is, I heard you talk a little bit about data. I heard you talk a little bit about what it took within your own organization to make this shift. So can you just focus in for a minute on how you got that buy-in and how your community has responded to that?
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to starting the low barrier winter shelter that January of 2015 and the data and responses that we had from that first season, we worked with our local homeless coordinating board, developed a steering committee, if you will, of different providers, from everyone from our housing authority, local law enforcement, substance use treatment provider, my own organization, Shelter House, funders were included, and decided that we wanted to investigate this understanding that we had of a number of individuals who were familiar faces. You also hear the term frequent users, folks that were coming through the doors of our different organizations, that we just, in a narrative and anecdotal way, understood to be cycling in and out of our services and unsuccessfully, and finally returning to our streets. So using public data, we identified 26 individuals who had the highest interaction with local law enforcement, and worked with our team to kind of tier out the individuals. People identified folks that they had closer relationships than others, and they were tasked with going out into the community and finding individuals and seeking their permission to work with us in developing case studies. We were able to work with 4 individuals and develop case studies that spanned the course of about 4.5 years, and collected data on their service utilization, the individual service utilization, and costs incurred. I should also add, these were individuals that were known to be chronically unsheltered, not necessarily known to fit that definition of chronically homeless.
Yeah.
Within the 4 individuals, we had a cost average of about $140,000 of unreimbursed costs per year. For the entire research period, it was over 2.5 million of costs that were essentially being spent to keep people in this cycle of recidivating across the different services and returning back to the streets of our community, oftentimes in worse health than they had been before. We used this data and started just galvanizing our community and reaching out to local policymakers, elected officials, municipal staff, building people's understanding of housing first and permanent supportive housing, of the costs that were already being incurred, the nature of the problems that we were seeing. And over time, we're able to successfully build quite phenomenal support within our community and also within our state finance authority for developing permanent supportive housing and moving forward. And tragically, before we were able to open our first permanent supportive housing development, 2 of the 4 individuals died while living on the streets. And that's a memory, and that's a charge that we carry with us every day.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I see a couple of notes in the chat asking if you could put a link in to that study that you did, if it's publicly available. Folks would definitely appreciate that. I mean, doing that at the program level as well as at the system level is a big undertaking. So thank you so much. And Chrissy, again, thank you for being here with us today. I'm going to turn it over now to my friend and colleague, Donald Whitehead, who is the Executive Director of the National Coalition for the Homeless, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how this will impact people experiencing homelessness now. Donald?
Thank you, Ann, and certainly I consider you a friend as well. And thank you and the Low Income Housing Coalition and the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities for giving me the opportunity to talk today about the impact on people experiencing homelessness. Now, we know that statistically, housing first works. Some statistics say it works up to 90%. And so we're very grateful for those pioneers like Dr. Simbaris, who started the project. But we believe that everything we do in this work should be guided by those with lived experience. And we regularly talk to people with lived experience. And what we find is that people do want to have housing at first and foremost. If you talk to people, sometimes you'll hear that people that are living on the streets of our country don't want housing. That is the biggest myth that has ever been produced. When you talk to people, they absolutely want housing. I have been working on homelessness and issues around homelessness for almost 30 years. I've never in that time ever heard anyone say that they wanted to live on the streets and they would not accept housing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about other conversations we've had over the past several years. We've seen a rise in both this anti-housing first sentiment, and also just a move to communities towards criminalization. We know that criminalization of people experiencing homelessness does not work in any form or fashion and can have devastating life or death impacts on people who are experiencing homelessness. We already know that people who are experiencing homelessness have shorter lifespans, and those lifespans are shortened even more by criminalization practices like encampment raids. Some people call them sweeps. I call them raids because we should never consider moving people sweeps, because you sweep trash and you sweep leaves. You should not be sweeping people in any form or fashion. And so a lot of really important research has kind of looked at the impacts of these raids on encampments across the country. We've seen that people's health is negatively affected in so many different ways, from worsening trauma and mental health concerns to just moving people's items that they will use for their care, medical equipment. Sometimes it's medication itself. These things are destroyed in these not well thought out encampment raids. They happen at different times during the day. To add insult to injury, some of the people are working while their items are being destroyed. They're trying to move out of homelessness, but their items are being destroyed. We know that it has so many impacts on just the trust that sometimes takes years for homeless service providers to create with people living on the street. And it can just be a couple of seconds for all those years of work and all that energy that's provided to people to gain their trust, to help them understand the value of being in their own housing unit. It's completely destroyed in a moment's time because people have not been creative about the solutions to homelessness. In so many communities, what is really a structural issue, the lack of providing the resources necessary to the fullest extent of the problem. We've never had enough resources to fully address homelessness. And because we have not had enough resources, we continue to see homelessness grow. We know that people are moved out of homelessness on a regular basis in the hundreds of thousands, but we know that every day hundreds of thousands of more show up at our doors because we have not addressed the structural issues like racism and the lack of affordable housing. And as Dr. Simbaris said, we need housing production. It does not have to be any particular kind of housing production, but we do need housing production. Housing first absolutely works, permanent supportive housing works, but all other kinds of housing are necessary. I do have a few slides, so let's go to the next slide, please. Again, the National Coalition for the Homeless is the oldest organization that works on homeless issues. And at the forefront of what we do is to constantly be in contact and talking to people who've experienced homelessness, because we know that those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So all of our policy, all of our projects are driven by conversations with people living on the street. Next slide, please. And again, we know that now this is a picture from the Bureau of Prisons, and this was an article that was talking about the revolving door, people being criminalized and then being placed in institutions. We know that this particularly happens when it comes to people with mental health issues, and unfortunately, they don't get the treatment that's necessary, so it becomes a revolving door. Next slide, please. And so we know again that sweeps exacerbate health problems and create new ones. They create additional barriers to accessing housing and employment, and extends the time that people remained unhoused. That's very important. A lot of programs have brought people into the programs and started the process of moving them into housing. And once those people are moved from wherever they were engaged at, that issue of housing those individuals comes a lot more difficult. And again, it undermines the trust in the system of care, disrupts the engagement of outreach workers and street medicine practitioners and other community groups like PATH and the Veterans Administration that are providing outreach. It completely undermines those relationships. And I know that for sure as a former outreach worker, that it's really hard to re-engage with somebody after they've lost trust in you and the system because of these raids. Next slide, please. People experiencing homelessness lose valuables, and not just, I talked about medical devices. We've even seen wheelchairs being dumped into dumpsters when these raids happen. But identification, things that are vital to someone getting through the system to be able to obtain housing is lost. We also see other personal items like family heirlooms. All of these things are subject to the raid that happens and subject to being destroyed. And it also forces people into isolation. And we've seen over the past years the many different people who've been attacked, some to the extent where they've lost their lives. Many of those happen in isolation. And I can't blame cities for their deaths, but I can blame cities for putting them in positions where they're isolated and they're more vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. And again, people experiencing homelessness have shorter lifespans because of all of these things. Next slide. So there are a couple of really important things that we want to leave with you today. There are some very important messages that in our local communities we need to share, because many of the criminalization practices are not practices that are happening at a federal level. They're practices within states and cities and counties. And we need to be at the table in those communities to really be sharing some of the messages that you'll see here. First of all, housing should be a human right. It's a human right in all of the other developed countries in this world through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we believe that housing should be a right, especially in the richest country in the history of the world. We know that homelessness is solvable. We've seen so many cases of communities coming together and really making a dent in homelessness. And it's solvable as an overall issue if we can convince our elected officials to truly put the resources into the issue that need to be into the issue. Now, we saw during COVID resources being delivered for prevention and for housing, and we saw how much of an impact that made. Some communities, the streets were there was nobody on the streets basically because we were putting people in hotels and we were putting people in housing on a regular basis because of those resources. And so we need to make sure that we continue to push for those resources on a state, federal, and local level. Homelessness is not a choice. People are not homeless because they choose to be, they're homeless because they're forced to be. And I know that Ann is there because I'm running out of time, but please remember all of these messages. Homelessness is solvable. It's a structural issue and we need to address those issues. We need to produce more housing and we can end homelessness in America.
Donald, thank you so much. You know, we ended the presentation portion of today's webinar with you and with your remarks, in part because we wanted to make sure that folks leave with the impact on people who are closest to this issue, the impact on people who are currently experiencing homelessness in their minds. And so I just so appreciate, I appreciate your comments. I also will commit to starting to use language like raid rather than sweep. I thought that was important and compelling. And before I turn it over to Steve, I just want to note, again, one more thanks to Donald. And I want to note that for folks who have been asking for evidence, there are now a number of links in the chat to various and sundry studies and a book about this work that will that points to the evidence that a number of the speakers today have talked about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Berg, the Alliance's Chief Policy Officer. You've heard a lot about programs, what would happen if Housing First was turned back. And Steve is going to talk a little bit about what we can do about it. Steve?
All right, great. Thanks, Ann. And thanks to everybody who's on the call today and sticking with us here. So I'm going to talk about, as Ann said, a couple of things, the general areas of work that people can do to use this information to make more change. And I would also say that if you need help, specific help implementing any of these, please be in touch with any of the organizations that are sponsoring this call. We all have staff who have done this kind of thing for years and years and years, can help any community who wants to do it. Okay, the first one, next slide, please. So the first one is about educating your congressional delegation. As people probably know, Congress is the one who makes decisions about funding for a lot of these programs. We say we don't have enough housing, the Section 8 voucher program isn't big enough, the homeless programs don't have enough money. That's because Congress decided not to spend enough money on that. So we need to make sure that the members of Congress understand that this is a problem in the community. It's something we know the solution to, and that we need their help doing it. You can see that some of the activities are about doing site visits where you can invite members and key staff, get to know the key staff in the congressional offices. The last point here is Republicans and Democrats. There's no excuse. The fact that your member of Congress is a Republican is not an excuse not to reach out to them. We know that the people in Congress who have been attacking Housing First have been part of the Republican Party, but there are also many, many people who we've already been able to turn to defend Housing First and understand that's the right way to do this work. So we need to make sure that this is not seen as just one party issue. And at the same time, Democrats need to know that this needs to be a priority. Next slide, please. The next thing is build local alliances. Mayors are very important on this kind of work. Mayors are concerned about homelessness. They're hearing from all kinds of other people about how Housing First can be a problem. We need to make sure our mayors are on board with us about what's going on. Hospitals and healthcare, we've heard from lots of healthcare providers about how important it is to help people get into housing, to stabilize their housing. This is in all the studies that people have talked about Housing First. The biggest winner in terms of money is the healthcare system. They're the ones who can gain the most from adopting Housing First and keeping a good Housing First system, and they need to be our allies in this. Landlords, people have different experiences with different landlords, and they're certainly not every landlord is going to be helpful, but they are the people whose bank accounts the money ends up in. So they have a reason to invest more money in housing programs. Communities that have made real progress here have found landlords who are willing to work with them, find landlords who are willing to work with them. And then, as I said, anyone who would like to see less homelessness. It's all, we're seeing a lot more of this now. People are saying there's too much homelessness. We need to do something about this. We know what to do about it. We need to make sure people understand that we do know what to do about it. Next slide, please. So one other little thing you can do, this will be, you'll get the slides, and there's a statement of values about criminalization and opposing criminalization that we at the Alliance are collecting signatures on from a range of people that we've worked with, our friends that are on this call to do this. So if you can help us out, take a look at that. If you or your organization can sign on to that, that'd be great. Next slide, please. So just to review, these are the key points that we made today. the way, this is the way, Housing First is the way to deal with homelessness effectively. The arguments against it are invalid. We've tried lots of other things. That's the main thing you've heard here. Housing First is what we put in place because those other things really don't work very well. So we're going to keep doing that, and we're glad everyone's interested, and we hope you'll reach out to us for help in all of these things. So let me turn it back to Ann.
Steve, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who has been with us today, and for folks who have participated in the chat and in the Q&A. We will be doing our third webinar in the series on February 21st. And that webinar will feature a leading researcher on homelessness and 2 highly respected providers of homelessness services who will talk to us about how Housing First promotes good health. So with that, I know it's 4:01, we're a little bit over time. Thank you so much again to all of you for all of your work. And thank you all so much for those of you who are in the audience who stayed with us. We had over 1,000 people today. Please do what Steve said. That's what I try and do at my office, and what other folks should do. And you have on this slide a number of resources to conduct advocacy. Take care and have a great rest of the day, everybody.